title, The Thing That Runs Beside You. Consider Elias Voss, a man who chose distance the way other men choose drink. He retreated north until north ran out, until the only things that knew his name were 6 sled dogs and a trapline strung through 50 miles of boreal darkness. He called it peace. He called it self-sufficiency. He called it living on his own terms. But there are territories on this earth where the old laws still apply, where the wilderness is not merely a place, but a judgment. And somewhere in the space between the last human light and the first wolf cry, Mr. Voss is about to discover what it means to be genuinely, completely known. The dogs smelled it before he saw it, which was the natural order of things, and Elias had learned long ago to trust that order. Kodiak went first, the big lead dog, a 110-pound Malamute with a broad chest and the disposition of a patient monk, and Kodiak's hackles rose the way smoke rises from a fire that hasn't caught yet, slow, almost lazy, but committed, then Sable, then the 2-wheel dogs, Frost and Rook, and finally the pair in swing, Moses and the young bitch he'd started calling Penny because she'd come to him copper-colored out of a litter he'd bought off a Fairbanks breeder. All 6 of them, in the space of a single cold breath, shifted from the loose, distance-eating trot they'd been running for 4 hours to something pulled tight as a bowstring. Elias had been watching the sky. The aurora had started an hour past green first, the usual curtain pull, then a kind of bruised violet that he'd seen maybe twice in 11 years of Alaskan winters. He'd been riding the drag brake easy, letting the dogs set the pace, watching the light fold and unfold above the spruce line, and he'd let himself feel something close to beauty. This was the mistake. You didn't look up out here. You watched the trail, and you watched your dogs, and you watched the tree line for anything that watched back. He looked down when Kodiak broke stride. The team had slowed to a walk, all 6 animals with their heads angled hard to the left, noses working, tails down. Not fearful tails, dogs showed fear differently, tucked and curled. These were tails held low with a deliberate, considered quality, like soldiers lowering weapons before a negotiation that might not hold. Easy, Elias said. His voice came out white in the cold. 31 miles still to his cabin. He knew the number precisely because he knew this trail, the way a man knows a recurring dream. Every rise, every drainage crossing, every stand of black spruce that thinned toward the river bottom where he'd set 6 Connie bear traps for marten and found. This afternoon, 4 of them sprung and empty, and one of them containing a front paw from something much larger than a marten, sheared off at the joints so cleanly it had seemed almost deliberate. He'd stood over that trap for a long moment, turning the paw with his boot, noting that the snow around it bore no blood trail, none at all, just a set of tracks departing that were heavier and more widely spaced than the arriving tracks, as if whatever had lost the paw had left the scene somehow less impeded than it had arrived. He'd pulled that thought out of his mind like a splinter and packed the sled and turned for home. Now the spruce to his left held a darkness that was darker than it should be. The moon was up and 3/4 full. Good light for travel, which was why he'd pushed out to this section of the line despite the temperature sitting at 38 below, and the trees wore their snow loads in silver and blue, but the darkness on the left side of the trail, 100 yards off in a loose stand of white spruce that grew along a frozen creek bed, was the deep, light-eating black of something that absorbed rather than reflected. It was standing still. He counted his heartbeats and reached behind him into the sled bag and found the rifle by feel, a .375 H&H bolt-action he'd carried for 11 years without firing anything larger than a black bear, and he brought it across his lap without standing on the runners, keeping his movements slow and his eyes forward, not looking directly at the darkness in the trees. You didn't look directly. Eye contact was a challenge, and challenges were invitations. "All right," he said to the dogs quietly, calmly, the voice he used when conditions were bad and he needed them to trust him more than they trusted their own nerves. "All right, forward, trail." Kodiak moved forward. The others followed, because Kodiak was that kind of dog, and this was why Elias had paid $3,000 for him 7 years ago from a musher who'd said, without particular sentiment, "He'll get you home when you can't get yourself there." The thing in the trees moved with them. It kept pace without sound. He knew it was there because the dogs knew it was there, their heads tracking it, angled left like compass needles, finding north. And after 200 yards, he let himself look. It was a wolf. That was the first and most obvious reading of it. And his brain wanted to stay there, wanted to classify it and file it and apply the known behaviors. Wolves didn't attack dog sleds. Wolves were cautious. Wolves were intelligent enough to weigh risk, and most of the time a fired shot above the head or a thrown object would redirect them. He'd encountered wolves 18 times in 11 years. Twice they'd shadowed him for a mile or more. Never once had he felt the thing he was feeling now, which was not exactly fear, but was fear's older, quieter cousin. A deep somatic recognition that he was not the most dangerous thing on this trail. The wolf was large. He was a large man, 6'2", 220, not an ounce of fat in the 11th winter, and he could judge distance and size accurately under moonlight because his life had required him to develop this skill. The wolf was large the way a draft horse is large, in a manner that reorganized your ideas about the category of animal you thought you were looking at. Its shoulder line, visible between the spruce trunks in brief strobes of moonlight as it moved, came to a height that his mind kept refusing to verify. Its gait was fluid and covered ground with a telescoping, unhurried efficiency that required no apparent exertion. And then it looked at him, not the way a wolf looks at a potential prey animal, measuring distance, measuring speed, calculating. It looked at him the way a person looks at someone they've been waiting for. There was a quality of recognition in it that was worse than hunger, worse than aggression, because hunger and aggression he understood. They followed rules. They had limits built in by survival logic and energy economy. Recognition had no such limits. In the moonlight, its eyes were the yellow of old bone, and they held him for a full 4-second beat before it looked away. "Let's go," he said to the dogs, and he stood on the runners and let them build speed. And the cold hit him like a wall of white, and the thing in the trees kept pace with the stride of something that had never once, in all its years, needed to hurry. He'd come to Alaska because of Rachel. Or rather, he'd come to Alaska because of the version of himself that existed in relation to Rachel. And he'd needed to put enough distance between himself and that version that it couldn't find him. She hadn't left him for someone else. She'd left him for the same reason people leave an unlocked room. Not because anything is wrong with the room, exactly, but because a room that's never locked might as well have no walls. "You let everything in," she'd said, the night she left. There's nothing you won't absorb. It's like trying to love a lake. Everything just disappears into you. He'd moved to Alaska 6 weeks later. He'd spent 2 years in Anchorage working equipment at a mine, before the pull of actual wilderness got too strong, and he'd taken what he'd saved and gone north to a place where the nearest road was 30 miles away, and the nearest neighbor was 12 miles past that. He'd built a life that was entirely precisely his: trapline in winter, garden in summer, generator for the laptop he used to order parts and supplies, no internet beyond functional necessity. He'd traded the problem of being a lake for the problem of being a stone. Rachel had been right, and he'd known she was right from the moment she said it, which was perhaps why he'd overcompensated so completely. You can spend so long trying to become solid that you forget solid things can be broken. He was thinking about this, not because the moment called for introspection, but because his mind was doing the thing minds do in crisis, pulling up everything it deemed relevant, creating a kind of emergency inventory. When the wolf crossed the trail, it came out of the trees at a 45-degree angle 30 yards ahead, and it crossed the packed snow in 4 strides, 4 enormous snow-soundless strides, and disappeared into the black spruce on the right side. The dogs lost their minds. Kodiak broke into a dead sprint, which was wrong. A lead dog breaks into a sprint at the sight of a predator crossing the trail, only if the dog's survival instinct has completely overridden its training, which required a level of threat that Elias had never induced in Kodiak in 7 years. The team hit 30 miles an hour in the space of 100 yards, and the sled began to fishtail on a slight right-hand curve, and he threw his full weight onto the brake and felt the claw drag through the packed snow with a sound like tearing canvas. And the team ran anyway. Ran with a pure animal panic that made the brake irrelevant. "Whoa." He put everything into it. "Whoa, Kodiak. Whoa," Kodiak heard him. Elias could see it. The big dog's pace broke fractionally, a question passing through the animal. And then the right side of the trail erupted. The wolf came out of the spruce on the right, not running, but simply appearing, the way very large things appear when they've been very still, all at once, occupying space that had seemed empty. It was 20 yards from the sled, and it matched the team's pace without breaking into a run. It was running, yes, but the word felt inadequate in the way that calling a thunderstorm loud felt inadequate. It moved with the inevitability of something obeying gravity. Elias saw it clearly for the first time. The wolf's fur was black except for a ragged gray-white blaze across its chest and one forepaw. Its size, God, its size was the thing that kept reorganizing his perception, kept forcing his mind to loop back and re-examine. It was not a large wolf. He'd been wrong to call it that, the same way a person is wrong to call a grizzly bear a large brown dog. It was a wolf the way a grizzly is a bear, technically accurate, deeply insufficient. Its musculature was wrong, too dense, too individuated, like something engineered rather than evolved. Its legs were too long in a specific, architecturally precise way, built for a stride that belonged to a faster world. And the front left paw had been severed at the joint, below the wrist, and yet the animal ran without limp or accommodation. The stump touching the snow as if the missing paw were still there, still bearing weight, the snow holding the impression of a paw that was absent. He'd stared at that severed paw by the trap. He'd stood over it for a full minute. The wolf turned its head and met his eyes with those old bone irises, and he understood, with a clarity that had no room in it for doubt or metaphor, that it was aware of this coincidence entirely. It ran beside the sled for 50 yards with its head turned toward him, holding his gaze, and then it pulled ahead and disappeared into the darkness in front of the team. The dogs ran. There was nothing else to do but let them. Elias had 31 miles of trail between him and his cabin, and he was now traveling at a speed that would not be sustainable. The dogs would burn themselves out in 20 minutes at this pace, and 20 minutes from here left him 26 miles from home in 38 below dark with a wolf that had decided he was its specific, singular interest. He worked the brake in pulses, not trying to stop the team, but trying to manage the sprint down to something the dogs could hold for an hour if they had to. Kodiak fought him on it for a quarter mile and then submitted, dropping to a fast trot that was still faster than their normal travel pace but would not kill them inside the hour. He kept the rifle across his lap with his right thumb on the safety. The trail ahead was empty. The trail behind was empty. Both felt equally wrong. The country he was crossing was open muskeg between two river drainages, flat, treeless, the snow surface wind-scoured to a hard blue crust that the sled runners sang against. No cover, nothing taller than knee-high sedge poking through the crust on either side of the trail, under the aurora which had gone back to green and was moving in long, slow waves. The muskeg was so open and so bright that he could see half a mile in every direction. Nothing moved. He watched the dogs. They were still running with their ears flat and their tails down, but the existential panic had left them. They were afraid, controlled, running with purpose. Kodiak was watching the trail ahead the way he watched it in a whiteout, measuring, attending, ready. The swing dogs kept glancing left. The wolf was still on the left then, in the tree line a quarter mile across the frozen muskeg, pacing them. He did the math. 31 miles at their current pace, call it 12 miles an hour, would put him at the cabin in 2.5 hours. He had 2.5 hours of dog left, maybe 3, if the wolf stayed in the trees and didn't close again, and the animals weren't running in the full burn of fear. He had food for the dogs in the sled, which he could use at a rest stop if he needed to, but stopping felt catastrophic in a way he couldn't fully reason through, only feel. The wolf would stop when he stopped. The wolf, he suspected, would come closer when he stopped. He reviewed what he knew. He knew wolves did not behave this way. Wolves were strategic but not theatrical. Wolves did not look at a musher the way a person looks at someone they've been expecting. They did not cross a trail in front of a panicked team and then disappear to take up a flanking position. They did not absorb a steel-jawed coney bear trap at the wrist, lose the paw, and walk away without bleeding. He knew he did not believe in werewolves. He was a practical man who had lived alone for 9 years and had arrived at a functional, working set of beliefs about the natural world, none of which contained room for folklore. He believed in what his hands could build and what his eyes could measure. He also knew that the tracks departing the trap had been deeper and more widely spaced than the tracks arriving. He had noted this and set it aside because the explanation available to him, that the animal had grown between the moment of arrival and the moment of departure, was not an explanation his belief system could contain. He was revising his belief system in real time, which was not comfortable but was, he understood, necessary. The wolf came back at the river crossing. He'd been expecting trouble here. The Porcupine River crossing was a half-mile stretch of glaciated river ice with a 6-foot cut bank on either side, a natural bottleneck exposed, the one place on the trail where the tree line was close on both banks. He'd crossed it 500 times and had never once done so without noting that it was the kind of place where the country's terms applied most forcefully. He came down the left bank cut bank with the sled runners chattering on the hardpack and Kodiak holding a clean line onto the river ice, and the wolf was waiting on the opposite bank. It sat on the ice at the base of the right bank cut bank, in the direct center of the trail, and it waited with a stillness so complete that for a second he thought it was a marker post, something left by a previous traveler. Then Kodiak saw it, and the whole team locked up hard, and the sled came off Kodiak's wheel dogs, and he hit the brake, and they stopped on the river ice. 50 yards from the wolf, 60 yards from the right bank, 50 yards. He could see it clearly. In the open light of the frozen river, away from the broken dark of the spruce, the wolf was impossible. He used the word not emotionally but literally. The form in front of him exceeded the specifications of wolves. Its head was the wrong shape, too broad across the temples, too flat across the muzzle, as if something had taken the wolf skull and pressured it laterally, giving the face a quality that was almost, not quite, but almost capable of expression. Its chest was too deep, its forelimbs were too mobile. He could see, even at 50 yards, that its front legs bent in a direction that wolf forelegs did not bend. It sat with its forepaws in front of it, and the left forepaw terminated in a clean stump that rested on the ice as if nothing was missing. It watched him. He raised the rifle. He was a good shot, not a competitive shooter, not someone who'd trained at it, but a man who had hunted for his own food for 11 years in conditions that required accuracy on the first shot, because the country did not give you second shots. He settled the crosshairs on the center of the wolf's chest, over that gray-white blaze, and he breathed out half his air and let his finger find the trigger. The wolf's eyes moved to the rifle. Then they moved back to his face, and the wolf, he watched it happen, watched it with total clarity and complete disbelief. The wolf shook its head, not the head shake of an animal working off water or cold, a slow, deliberate lateral movement. Once, twice, a pause, once more, a gesture he had made himself 10,000 times in the universal human idiom of no. His finger left the trigger. He was not aware of deciding this. The wolf stood, turned to the right, and walked up the cut bank and into the spruce and was gone. He sat on the sled runners on the river ice in 38 below dark for 30 seconds, not thinking, just breathing. Kodiak looked back at him. The look contained a quality he could only describe, and never would to anyone as well. "Yeah," Elias said. "I know." He stood up. He took a long, stabilizing breath that tasted of ice and pine and river mud locked 20 feet below him. He pointed the team at the right bank cut bank. "Trail," he said. "Home." He had 28 miles left when he began to understand what the wolf wanted. It came to him the way understanding usually comes, not as revelation, but as the slow arrangement of existing pieces into a shape that had been there all along. He'd been too occupied with survival to think, and now that the wolf had withdrawn was still out there, he knew, shadowing them, but had withdrawn from direct engagement. His mind was working through it, the marten paw in the trap, the tracks that were heavier leaving than arriving. The wolf that had crossed the trail in front of the team, not to attack, to redirect, the flanking position through the muskeg, not to close, to escort, the crossing bottleneck, not an ambush, a confrontation, the head shake. What did you call a wolf that used its body the way a shepherd used a dog? What did you call a wolf that shook its head instead of charging? He thought about Rachel. He didn't know why he thought about Rachel at that moment, and then he did know. You let everything in. There's nothing you won't absorb. It's like loving a lake. He'd come out here to become stone. He'd done it thoroughly. He checked his trapline on a schedule and killed what he caught and ate what he killed and ordered what he couldn't make and spoke to the dogs and to no one else. He'd built 9 years of perfect, closed, stone-solid solitude, and he hadn't asked once whether the country he'd built it in had any opinion on the matter. The country had an opinion. He was 20 miles from the cabin when the wolf came back to the trail. It came from the right side this time, out of a creek drainage choked with alder, and it didn't cross. It fell in behind the sled, 40 yards back, running in the packed trail the dogs had left, and it ran there with a loose, ground-eating stride and its head up and its eyes on his back. He knew it was there because the wheeled dogs kept glancing behind them, and because he could hear it, a sound just below audible, a kind of bass resonance, like the lowest key of a piano played in the next room. He did not look back for a long time. When he did, finally, over his right shoulder, the wolf was 30 yards behind him, running easily, and its eyes were on his with that unrelenting, patient, personal quality that he had no framework for and was done trying to find one. He met its gaze and held it, and the wolf did not speed up or slow down or perform any action, it just ran. It ran beside him through the dark, behind him, and then, gradually, as the miles thinned toward home, it moved up along the left side of the team until it was running abreast of Kodiak, 2 feet to the left of the big lead dog, and Kodiak ran with it the way a dog runs beside something it has arrived at a truce with. The Aurora ran overhead in long green sweeps. The temperature dropped to 42 below, and Elias stopped noting it. The trail unrolled ahead of him in the moonlight, each mile a thing he'd crossed so many times he could feel the terrain in his legs before the sled reached it. He was exhausted in a way that went beyond muscle, a fundamental tiredness, the kind that isn't about sleep. He began to talk. He didn't decide to do this either. The words came, the way breath came, involuntary, continuous, necessary. He talked about Rachel. He talked about the lake she'd said he was and whether she'd meant it as a condemnation or a description. He talked about the 9 years and whether they'd been about solitude or about hiding from the specific judgment that solitude avoids, which is other people knowing you. He talked about the trapline and whether you could love something you harvested and whether love was even the right word, or whether attend was better, witness was better, show up for was better. He talked about his dogs by name and what each one had taught him. He talked to the wolf, specifically, directly, the way you talk to the only other person in the room. The wolf ran beside him and said nothing, which was not the same as not listening. He was 5 miles out when it stopped. He felt it before he saw it. The dog's posture shifted, something released, and he looked left, and the wolf was standing in the trail, 30 yards back, watching him go. He braked the team to a stop and turned on the runners and looked at it directly. Full moonlight. No ambiguity. Its old bone eyes on him across the cold, and the ghost paw resting in the snow and its chest moving with long, easy breaths. He understood not with his thinking mind, which was frozen and exhausted and would spend years sorting through this, but with whatever was underneath the thinking mind, that this was the boundary. The wolf's territory ended here, or his began here, or perhaps there were categories that were neither territory nor trespass, but something else, something for which the language hadn't been written yet. He reached into the sled bag without looking away and found the quarter of moose he'd packed for the dog's evening meal, and he pulled it out, 15 pounds of frozen rear quarter still on the bone, and he set it in the snow at the side of the trail. He did not know why he did this. It wasn't bribery, and it wasn't tribute, and it wasn't payment exactly. It was something closer to acknowledgement. It was the gesture of a man who has been seen doing something he thought he was doing in private. The wolf looked at the meat, then it looked at him. It dipped its great head once down, and then up, and turned and walked off the trail to the right, and into the black spruce, and did not come back. Elias stood on the runners in the dark for a long moment. "Okay," he said, "not to the dogs, not to the wolf, to himself or to the country or to whatever runs the bureaucracy of moments like this one. Okay," he said again, "trail." He reached the cabin at 2 a.m. The dogs went into their boxes with the mechanical trust of animals who've covered enough hard country to know the difference between a night that survived and a night that wasn't. And he fed them and checked their paws by headlamp and found everything sound. And then he stood in the door of the cabin for a long time before going inside. The aurora was still running, green and violet, the violet stronger now, folding and refolding over the spruce line to the east, where the darkness was absolute and enormous and completely, perfectly indifferent to him. He went inside. He started the wood stove and put water on for coffee and sat at the table in his coat until the room warmed enough to take it off. And then he sat without the coat and put both hands flat on the table and felt the grain of the wood he'd planed himself from lumber he'd hauled in by sled 6 years ago. He thought about the wolf's eyes, the recognition in them, the terrible intimacy of being known by something that operated outside every comfort and convention that made being known bearable. He thought about the head shake, about what a man does when a wolf shakes its head at him, and he lowers the rifle and he listens to that. He thought, Rachel was right, but she was wrong about what it meant. A lake isn't empty. A lake is full. The problem with being a lake is that you can't tell what's yours and what came from somewhere else, and that terrifies people who need to know where the edges are. He picked up the satellite phone from the shelf where it lived in its charging cradle, and he looked at it for a long time. He had his ex-wife's number in it. He had his brother's number. He had a woman in Fairbanks he'd met 2 years ago at a resupply who'd given him her number and said, without pressure, without agenda, if you ever want company, and he'd put the number in and never used it. He set the phone back in its cradle. Not yet. He wasn't ready, and he knew he wasn't ready. But the word yet was new. The word yet meant that somewhere in the last 45 miles he'd crossed from no to not right now, and that was a distance that had taken 9 years to cover. He poured his coffee and held the cup and listened to the stove tick and the wind find the corners of the roof, and somewhere in the spruce a great horned owl called twice and then stopped, and the night held the silence between sounds the way good country holds space between things, not as absence, but as room. He slept without dreaming, which was its own kind of grace. In the morning he went out to check the dogs and found a set of tracks in the new snow that had fallen in the small hours, wolf tracks, enormous, approaching the dog yard and then stopping at its perimeter, the way a visitor stops at the edge of a porch. They had stood there a while, whoever had left them, the tracks overlapping and settling in a tight cluster that spoke of time spent, of deliberate stillness, and then departing back across the clearing toward the spruce, the stride long and even and utterly untroubled. He stood over the tracks for a moment with his coffee. The left forepaw had left no print, but the snow was compressed where it should have landed, very slightly, as if by a weight that had no form, or a form that had found a way around the permanence of losing things. He wasn't sure how to think about that yet. He filed it next to the other things he wasn't sure how to think about yet, which was a drawer that had been empty for 9 years and was now suddenly filling. Elias Voss made it home. He always did. That was the kind of man he was, the stubbornly, quietly competent kind who survives by knowing the rules. The trouble with rules is that they only govern the territory they were written for. Some country has its own. What pursued him across 45 miles of Alaskan dark was not a monster, not a demon, not a creature from the catalogue of human nightmares. It was something considerably more dangerous, a mirror, one that ran on 4 legs and would not be outpaced and declined at point-blank range to be shot. There is a particular kind of man who retreats from the world and calls it living on his own terms. The wilderness, the real wilderness, not the pastoral postcard, but the old watching, deeply unsentimental wilderness, has a long tradition of sending such men something that can find them anyway. It found Elias Voss in the 45th year of his life. He was changed. He will deny this if asked, at least for a while. He will also, 3 months from now, dial a number in Fairbanks. And the woman who answers will say hello, and he will say, I'm not sure why I'm calling except that I think I am, and she will say, well, that's enough, and it will be, there is a dimension beyond the one we know, and occasionally it runs beside us in the dark, not to destroy us, but to refuse, with absolute patience and something very close to love, to let us disappear.